All right, welcome everyone to this session of Universal Basic Income and the Meaning of Work. Just so you know, this session is being recorded and will be posted online at a later date. The format here that we're following is that the speaker is going to speak for 45 minutes. We'll have a 10-minute break. We have a respondent who will speak for 15 minutes. The speaker will then have 5 minutes to respond to the commentary. We'll take another 5-minute break, and then we'll have questions and answers. Unfortunately, we'll have to do the stupid hand-raising kind of system. There's really no alternative to that. In the window that you have open in front of you, there should be some little icon that looks like this, where you can raise your hand. So please do think of questions and make notes of questions as they occur to you, because Alex, do you have a question?
I have an announcement, but I'll let you get through your sentence
All
first.
right.
Sorry. But anyway, that was at least a demonstration.
Oh, well, Alex, why don't you jump in now, and then I'll introduce the speaker.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I was just going to say apologies again for the last session. And I have made a publicly available version of the written presentation, the written talk, but I don't have any way to share it because I can't put it into the chat. But in a later on in the session, I'll show the link on my screen and you can copy it down by hand. But maybe I'll do that towards the end of this session for anybody who's interested.
All right. So without any more delays, I promise from the bottom of my heart, no more delays. It's my pleasure to introduce Tom Parr. Tom Parr is a lecturer in political theory in the Department of Government at the University of Essex. He works in political philosophy and has been doing work for quite some time that's really squarely on the themes that we're covering here in the workshop. He has just published a book called Introducing Political Philosophy, a Policy-Driven Approach, and he's currently writing a book called The Future of Work, Labor Markets, Technology, and Social Justice. The talk that he is about to present is called The Significance of Employment. And with that, I hand it over to you, Tom.
Great, thanks so much to Ben and to Alex for organizing this. I've just shared my screen. Is that visible to everyone?
It is to me, Tom, and if it's visible to me, it should be the same for everybody.
Great, wonderful. So thanks for organising this workshop. I'm really delighted to be involved, but also just the fact that questions relating to work, the future of work, are getting sustained attention by philosophers. These questions have been kind of addressed at length, I think, by people working in other disciplines, in sociology and political science and labour economics. And philosophers, I think, have been a little bit slow to turn their attention to them, except, of course, until very recently. And I think now these attentions are kind of every week I see something new being addressed relating to these issues. So I'm really thrilled that we're finally able to explore these issues in a bit more depth. So my aim in the 45 minutes that I have is to do something quite simple. That's just to explore what I'm going to call the significance of employment. I'm going to involve a little bit of a kind of housekeeping, how I tend to think about employment as a kind of conceptual matter. I'm then going to try to defend what I take to be a pretty familiar conclusion, namely that states should try to eliminate involuntary unemployment. I'm going to say a little bit about what that means and what I take to be a fairly straightforward argument for why we should do this. And then after having set out that initial case, I'm going to turn to two objections to that view. These objections have very little in common. One of them is a very widespread common objection, and I want to just explain how I think about it. And the other objection is, I think, addressed much less commonly, but is a really serious one. And I think it's a kind of shame that people don't engage with that objection in a more sustained fashion. And I'm going to say a little bit about what we should say in response, I think. Okay, so I think that the overall contribution of the paper maybe might not be terribly surprising, but I hope that the devil is in the detail, and that's really the contribution of what I'm going to say here today is the specifics of how we think about these issues. Okay, so the housekeeping to begin with. So one question is, what is the meaning of work? But before we get to that, I think we need to ask, what kind of thing is work, and how do we conceive of it within a broader theory of political morality, for example? So here's a pretty straightforward account. We can conceive of employment as involving just a kind of transaction in which one person buys or rents another's labor. And when viewed in those terms, employment is just a kind of good, or more specifically, a package of goods whose fruits an individual can enjoy in return for her labor. So I might sell my labor to my university, for example, and they're going to offer me a range of rewards in return, maybe the opportunity to discuss ideas with students, an income, certain health benefits, for example. And I think when looked at in this way, there's nothing mysterious about the idea of employment as a kind of good. Now, there are certain distinguishing features of employment when we think of it in these terms. Namely, it's a good or a transaction that extends over a continued period of time. It's not a kind of one-off transaction, but it often will go on for a sustained period and perhaps indefinite period. Again, that's not really unique to employment. There are lots of goods that have that character. When you purchase a pet, for example, then you have to pay the money, but you also incur certain duties to care for the pet that persist long into the future. So I don't think there's anything particularly odd or difficult to get our head around the idea of employment just being another such good. Now, employment varies hugely in terms of what it demands of us. So, for example, the hours that we must give up in order to work, and in terms of what it delivers. Plainly, some goods are much more rewarding than others, for example. And because of this, I think we can have situations where there's one kind of employment good, one kind of job offer, that's just valued very differently by individuals. In some cases, that's going to be to do with differences in preferences. You might enjoy working unsociable hours, whereas I hate it. In other cases, it might be down to variations in individual circumstances. It might be that you're much more in need of cash at short notice than I am, for example. I think that when we think about the meaning of work, then we're inevitably pushed towards a kind of pluralistic view that sees work as being valuable to individuals for a wide range of reasons. In fact, I'm tempted to say that we shouldn't essentialize the meaning of work in any way. People are going to search for work for very different reasons, sometimes in order to find self-fulfillment, sometimes because they need income, sometimes because their partner just wants them out of the house so that their partner can have a bit of free time. I think that when we theorize about the value of employment, then we have to take into account all of those heterogeneities in how people view work and the value that they attach to it. So, having said that, I think we can still make progress with certain things that work tends to have in common. And one of them is that in contemporary labour markets, I think that most employment opportunities are deemed valuable in the sense that people search for them, and when those opportunities are scarce, people take measures to improve their competitiveness. They go to university, for example, or they engage in some kinds of retraining in order to boost their chances of securing one of these scarce goods. Now, crucially, that's true even for individuals whose employment opportunities are pretty dire. So people on the poverty line with very few qualifications, for example, that if they enter the labour market, they might have very few opportunities. It might be work that's poorly paid, uninteresting, stigmatizing, involves being humiliated. But even when that's the case, it's significant that many individuals still search for employment of that kind. Now, the reason, of course, is fairly obvious, namely that the alternative, unemployment, is dire. You know, it might mean not being able to make ends meet or put food on the table, for example. But still, it's the case that people search for employment, and it is regarded by many people as a kind of asset that they should seek. So given this characterization of work or of employment, I think we have a kind of provisional case for eliminating involuntary unemployment. And the provisional case that we should do this because employment is a kind of valuable asset that people seek. And in virtue of that, opportunities to enjoy that kind of valuable asset should be fairly distributed between individuals, or at the very least, people should have fair opportunity to enjoy that asset. Now, I'm just going to call this the asset argument for eliminating involuntary unemployment. I don't take this argument to be especially controversial. I take it it's found in the work of people like Philippe van Parijs, as well as in lots of familiar understandings of how we think about the importance of eliminating involuntary unemployment. Now, what does this argument mean in more practical terms? So, according to the kind of standard definition, I guess what you might call the kind of economics 101 definition, an individual is involuntarily unemployed and so has a complaint on the basis of the asset argument if and only if she doesn't have a job and is searching for one. Now, that's a kind of good start, I think, but for a couple of reasons it's inadequate. First, this standard definition overlooks the presence of so-called discouraged workers. Discouraged workers are individuals who've given up looking for employment, perhaps sensibly, in virtue of their poor prospects. So you've been searching for a while, you've been unable to find a job, so you give up, you realize it's a waste of time. Well, according to the standard definition, you're no longer involuntarily unemployed. But that's hardly a triumph for social justice, I think. Insofar as we're concerned with the asset argument, then discouraged workers are part of the problem. A second reason that the standard definition is inadequate is that it's insensitive to the quality of the employment opportunities that individuals enjoy. So, for example, suppose that you knew that you could successfully find a job, but all the jobs were horrific. Suppose that they're incredibly badly paid, under torturous conditions, humiliating, for example, much more so than a life of unemployment. Well, in that case, you might sensibly give up searching for work. And so on the standard definition, you would not be involuntarily unemployed. But again, that hardly looks like a victory. The point here is, think about a future society in which either there's no work, or a society in which there is work available, but it's terrible. On the standard definition, then the level of involuntary unemployment in those societies would be very low, perhaps zero. But I take it that's not really what advocates of eliminating involuntary unemployment have in mind. We mean something more ambitious than that. So I think we're going to have to adjust the definition of involuntary unemployment to accommodate these two concerns. Here, what I think emerges is a view according to which an individual has a complaint if she lacks reasonable opportunities for employment, or something like that, where reasonable opportunities means if she were to search for them, then she would succeed, and the quality of the work meets some kind of threshold. Now, exactly what that requires is a kind of complex question, but I don't propose to address that now. Instead, I'm just aiming only to clarify the demands of the asset argument. Okay, now the implications of the asset argument are, I think, that governments should take measures to eliminate involuntary unemployment, and that we should be open-minded about the nature of those measures. So there's a kind of familiar distinction between supply-side and demand-side measures. Supply-side measures, I take it, include things like education and training. So governments might subsidize a certain degree or kind of education in order to boost workers' skills, thereby making them more attractive to potential employers. Alternatively, they might enact demand-side policies to increase the demand for labour. So, for example, governments might introduce a kind of employment subsidy where they promise or guarantee to pay a portion of the wages for staff who are currently employed. Now, the choice between supply side and demand side is likely to be highly contextual. It's likely to vary across different geographical regions, different economies, different kinds of labor markets, for example. And I don't propose to address exactly which mix of measures is going to be best. The important point for now is that if, like me, you're a defender of the asset argument, then you think that governments should pursue some measure of these policies in order to eliminate involuntary unemployment. Okay, before I get onto this objection, just one kind of minor point. Advocates of the asset argument, we tend not to believe that this is a kind of silver bullet, that once governments have eliminated involuntary unemployment, that's job done. There are, of course, a range of further questions that need addressing. We need to think about the quality of people's work lives, about the number of work hours that people spend at work. We need to think about inequalities of pay between workers. All I'm suggesting is that when governments eliminate involuntary unemployment, then it rids its economy of one particular kind of injustice, not that it therefore solves all of the relevant problems. Okay, now I want to focus on the first of the two main objections to the kind of asset argument. This is the one that I think will be more familiar to people. So the concern here is that the asset argument fetishizes employment. And this is because under alternative institutional arrangements, the benefits that accrue to employees could also be made to accrue to those who are involuntarily unemployed. The worry here is that employment does bring additional rewards, but this is only because of our economic policies, our infrastructure, our social norms, and so on. In an alternative society where employment wasn't the be-all and end-all of our lives, then perhaps involuntary unemployment wouldn't be such an impediment to the pursuit of these various goods. Okay, so this kind of view suggests that rather than guarantee that employment is available on reasonable terms to each individual, as maintained by the asset argument, instead perhaps governments can try to sever the link between the goods that employment currently provides and having to be employed in order to get those goods. We might think that the role of government is instead to decouple that link so that people who lack reasonable employment opportunities are still able to enjoy a range of the goods that accrue to those who are currently only to those who are currently employed. So I'm going to call this the kind of decoupling objection. I think that the decoupling objection has plenty going for it, and I think that it's really important to point out the extent to which contemporary societies do fetishize employment, and that does give us sound reason to try to break the link so that employment confers less advantage on individuals in comparison with those who are involuntarily unemployed than it currently does. But for the objection really to succeed, it relies on a kind of empirical claim, namely that it's feasible to sever the link between employment and the benefits that it provides, such that being involuntarily unemployed is no longer such a serious threat. Now, I do think that imagining such a society where there is no link between employment and those goods, I think that can be easily imagined in some cases. So when I think about a possible futuristic society of mass unemployment, then I do think that might change our way of life to such a degree that employment no longer has anywhere near the kind of role that it has today. So I'm open to the idea that we can sever the link in this way. But where I get much more nervous is when we consider societies in which employment remains the statistical norm. That is, I'm much more concerned about cases where a large number of individuals will remain employed and there's just a stubborn minority who are unemployed. Now, when that's the case, is it still feasible to sever the link between employment and the benefits that it provides? And there I'm much more skeptical. So here's why I'm more skeptical about these issues. So I'm sympathetic to a model of the significance of employment that I call the conditional model. So the conditional model states that our reasons to care about any given individual having opportunities for employment are conditional on the proportion of others in her society who are employed, or at least have the option to be employed. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is that employment opportunities are much more valuable to an individual when others in her society are employed than when the vast majority of others are unemployed. I think that this conditional model helps us to make sense of the idea that a society of mass unemployment, maybe we would have few or perhaps even no reasons to eliminate involuntary unemployment in that world. But in our world, where there's a persistent minority, 10% say, who are involuntarily unemployed, we should be concerned by that. Now, this conditional model of employment draws forth from the kind of what economists will call a network good. A network good is a good whose value to an individual increases in proportion to the number of others who possess that good. So a familiar toy example is being on social media, Facebook, for example. Now, if none of my friends is on Facebook, then the value of me joining Facebook is very small. But if all of my friends are on Facebook, then the value of me joining Facebook is much higher. The same, of course, is true for many other technologies, mobile phones, for example. Now, my suggestion is that employment is a network good just like that. I'm going to provide some simple illustrations for why I think this. So the first illustration appeals to the idea of self-respect, which often comes up in these debates. I'm going to say a bit more about that in a moment. So self-respect involves, stipulatively, involves having sufficient confidence in your own conception of the good life, in your beliefs about what's worthwhile, and confidence in your ability to pursue or carry those out. Now, I think that employment is intimately linked to self-respect defined in that way for a couple of reasons. First, there's the idea of social status. In labour markets where employment remains a statistical norm, then being employed is a way of kind of being seen in the eyes of others as leading a kind of normal life. And so you get a certain degree of social status from that. Now, of course, in societies where employment were no longer the statistical norm, then being unemployed wouldn't be such a marker in the way that it is in our society. And so we should expect employment to be not nearly so intimately connected to self-respect. So here's an example that I think provides some intuitive thoughts for this. In many communities, divorce was highly stigmatized, and individuals who did divorce enjoyed a kind of very low level of status in the eyes of others, because their lifestyle was seen as in some ways deviant or something like that. Now, that was a common attitude towards divorce, especially in communities that had very low levels of divorce. But as that's changed, as divorce has become part and parcel of normal life for many people, then those attitudes towards divorce change. And I think it's no longer seen as deviant in quite the same way. And I think that the same can be true for something like employment, that if employment no longer became the statistical norm, if unemployment became much more part and parcel of regular life, then I think this status idea of employment would kind of wither away a little. The second idea relating to self-respect is validation. And the idea here is that individuals, when they sell their labor in return for certain goods, including income, they get a certain degree of confidence from knowing that others have given up goods in order to purchase their labor. It makes them feel worthwhile. I think here, actually, when we look at the evidence, I think we find kind of compelling reports that people find this in work. So here I have in mind specifically the testimony of young mothers after a period away from the labour market. Perhaps they might be on parental leave, for example, and then these young mothers return to work. They often report a renewed sense of appreciation by others. And I think that this can kind of buoy people's self-confidence, and in a way that I think really isn't that surprising. So given that employment has these kind of links to self-respect, I believe that it's not surprising that it can bolster self-respect and the asset argument in these ways. So whilst it's true that philosophers tend to write about the link between employment and self-respect a lot, I think that that's really only part of the picture. And my hunch, perhaps more controversially, is that I think it's a kind of small part of the picture. In fact, employment is valuable to individuals for a much wider range of reasons than self-respect. Let me just give two simple illustrations. So there's plenty of reported evidence to show that individuals who are employed enjoy better marriage prospects and higher levels of family stability. So that, in fact, when we see areas of urban decline or suburbanization, where we see work leave some areas and move out to the suburbs, and we see ghettoization as a result, one of the effects of this is declining marriage prospects, declining family stability, high rates of divorce, for example. And of course, people care very deeply about these goods. They care very deeply about their marriage prospects, about family stability. And so one of the, I think, important benefits that employment provides is going to be that kind of stability. Second, employment can be valuable in the way that I've described, because people value congruent lifestyles. If everyone else in my community of friends has a particular lifestyle, that gives me a reason to change my lifestyle to fit in. So, for example, if lots of my friends are busy from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m, then I better arrange my free time to coincide with theirs rather than during that period of the day when they're busy. Now both of these ideas, marriage prospects and the congruence of conceptions of the good life, again, I think they support this kind of conditional model of the value of employment. That is, when lots of others are employed, such that if I'm unemployed, then my lifestyle is less likely to be congruent with others, and I'm more likely to be poorer and have fewer marriage prospects than others. I'm going to enjoy less advantage in the dating market, for example. Then employment is a particular concern, and we have these special reasons to eliminate involuntary unemployment by giving the employment opportunities. My hunch is that philosophers who have written about the significance of work have focused too much on self-respect and perhaps even social status as part of that, and not enough on these kind of more mundane goods associated with work, goods that are mundane but vitally important, I think. Okay, so I've offered a series of reasons in support of what I've called the conditional model of the significance of employment. Now, critics of this model might insist that even if employment remains a statistical norm, still governments can sever the link between employment and the goods that it typically provides. Now, that is an empirical claim, of course, and it's going to be very difficult to verify. But I'm suspicious of the feasibility of this option, at least within states that want to protect basic liberties. The reason I emphasize the protection of basic liberties is I take it that one such basic liberty is the right to be able to buy and sell other people's labor. And so what I have in mind is if there's a if it's a statistical norm for a large number of individuals to remain in employment, then I think people will inevitably want to buy and sell each other's labor. And that will bias much more heavily in favor of those whose talents happen to be highly marketable. And so the upshot is that we're going to have a persistent minority who are unemployed. And that worries me. You might think that we can respond to that by prohibiting the sale of labor, but I suspect that that's going to be ruled out on independent grounds. Okay, so where do we stand? On the conditional model of unemployment, a lot then turns on whether employment is here for good or whether the end of work is on the horizon. So I think it just pays briefly to mention something about that. So forecasts, predictions, spelling the end of work have been around for centuries. Famously, there was a huge discussion of these in the 1960s. Martin Luther King, for example, identified it as one of the biggest challenges facing the labor movement in the 1960s in the US. But these predictions have, I think, gained in recent years, probably, I think, because of celebrity endorsement more than anything else, because they've been championed by people like Elon Musk or Stephen Hawking, for example. Now, these narratives are captivating, but I think that they really miss something important, and that's that technology, more often than not, enhances the demand for labour rather than reduces the demand for labour. So here I'm just going to report the views of labour economists like David Autor, for example, who've done a lot to show that work is a pretty persistent phenomenon, and that individuals are we often are unimaginative when we think about the future of work. We see jobs disappearing, but we're not very good at predicting what the new ones are. So 50, 60 years ago, there was no solar energy industry. The television industry was minor, but these have now become big deals, and my hunch is that we should expect technology to create new industries in the future. What's more, I don't think that I'm especially eccentric or idiosyncratic. I think this is the kind of dominant view in labour economics, contrary to how it's sometimes reported in the media. Now, this doesn't mean that automation and technology poses no problem of unemployment. I think that's plainly false. It's clear that automation is going to threaten particular individuals' livelihoods, in fact, whole industries. But I think where the action lies is in these short to medium term disruptions to the labour market, rather than in these long-term forecasts of permanent technological unemployment or anything like that. So I think that's important. I think that philosophers are sometimes tempted by these kind of extreme predictions of mass unemployment. But I think once we look to the evidence, I think that we'll pretty quickly realise that those predictions are getting kind of disproportionate airtime in comparison with the problems that we're actually facing. Now, of course, these results are important because they bear directly on the implications of the conditional model. If you think that a post-work future is on the horizon and you're sympathetic to the conditional model, then you can say, well, let's aim for that post-work future. And if some people are involuntarily unemployed in that post-work future, that's not problematic for the reasons identified by the conditional model. However, if, like me, you think work's here to stay, then the implications of the conditional model are going to be very different. They're going to suggest a very weighty case here and now to address involuntary unemployment. So that deals with the first major objection to the asset argument, and I've offered a particular, perhaps controversial way of thinking about the significance of employment. In the time remaining, I want to discuss a second objection, which is a little more tricky, I think, and has not received much attention in the literature at all, which I think is surprising, given that the objection's lead proponent is one of the writers who perhaps is most familiar in these domains or in these debates, and that's Philippe Van Parijs. So Philippe Van Parijs argues in a short passage in Real Freedom for All that it's a mistake for governments to attempt to eliminate involuntary unemployment, since doing so unfairly privileges those who have a strong preference for employment over those who lack these preferences. So Van Parijs' thought is that when governments attempt to eliminate involuntary unemployment, they're effectively bribing labour market institutions in favour of taking on those who are involuntarily unemployed. And that's unfair. That bribe is unfair to those who have no such preference for employment. For those who would prefer to spend their days surfing, for example, or those who are just thoroughly repulsed by the idea of being pushed about by a boss they despise. Now, for reasons that are going to become apparent, this is going to be called the expensive taste objection to the asset argument. So let's get clear on the nature of this objection before I turn to my response. To do that, let's consider a very simple case, which we can call employment subsidy. There are three sets of individuals in the world that I'm envisaging. There are workers, there are those who are voluntarily unemployed, and those who are involuntarily unemployed. Now, the voluntary unemployed people, these are people, they're the surfers, they like hanging about, not doing much, or they prefer not being pushed about by bosses. And then there are the involuntarily unemployed who really wish that they could work. They want to sell their labor, but it's simply not in demand. Now we have an option. We must choose between the following two. The first is to tax the workers and to use the revenue collected to fund a subsidy that will create new employment opportunities for all those who are unemployed. So these new employment opportunities will be available to the voluntarily unemployed and the involuntarily unemployed. Now, this option will be valued by the involuntarily unemployed, who will be grateful that they can finally go to work. But the option will not be valued by the voluntarily unemployed, who say, you've used your resources in a wasteful way to the benefit of those individuals, but not to my benefit. The second option is to tax the workers and to use the revenue to fund the basic income. The basic income will be enjoyed by all individuals, including the voluntarily unemployed. And the voluntarily unemployed will say, we benefit from a basic income. We enjoy the fact that our income has been boosted by this second policy, rather than opting for the first, where the benefit accrues exclusively to those who are involuntarily unemployed. Advocates of basic income in this case say we should spend the tax revenue in a way that splits the value or shares the value among all individuals, rather than in a way that provides benefits only to those who are involuntarily unemployed, as the kind of new employment, as the kind of policy to create new employment opportunities would do. So which of those policies should we opt for? Now, here's the kind of argument that Van Parijs has in mind when advocating this expensive taste objection. He says, think about a second case to begin with. We can call this case wage subsidy. Now, similarly, in wage subsidy, there are, again, three sets of individuals. This time there are elite workers, middle class workers, if you like. And then there are two sets of working class workers, one of whom is satisfied with their work and the other is dissatisfied with their work. Again, we must choose one of the following two options. Now, the first option is to tax the elite middle class workers and use this revenue to fund a subsidy that will boost the wages of only the dissatisfied working class workers. Now, this will obviously be valued by those dissatisfied workers, but the satisfied workers will complain that we've used the revenue in a way that benefits one set of working class workers, but not the other. Our second policy is to use the same tax revenue, but to boost the wages of all working class workers, rather than only the dissatisfied ones. Here's the argument in its core. It involves two claims. The first is that in the wage subsidy case, we should opt for the second policy, which is to boost the wages of all working class workers, rather than to boost the wages only of the dissatisfied ones. So that's the first claim. The second claim is that the employment subsidy case is relevantly analogous to the wage subsidy case, such that if you believe in boosting the wages of everyone in wage subsidy, then you should favour basic income in employment subsidy. Those are the two steps of the argument. Now, the first step of the argument is controversial. In particular, it's rejected by those who defend a kind of welfarist view of distributive justice, namely those who think that the allocation of the benefits and burdens of social cooperation should be sensitive to individuals' particular utility levels, and in particular, that we have a reason to prioritise, to give greater resources to those who are dissatisfied rather than those who are satisfied. That's a welfarist take on the wage subsidy case. However, I'm going to assume that that's false. I'm going to assume a certain resource egalitarianism that says that that would be an error, since it would involve pandering to the expensive tastes of the dissatisfied workers. So it's a familiar kind of expensive taste objection. In fact, I'm sympathetic to that view, and Van Parijs is as well, and that's why I share this common premise with him, and why I think that this objection needs taking especially seriously. The problem, however, relates to the second step of Van Parijs' argument. Is it true that the two cases are strictly analogous, such that if we're committed to boosting the wages of all workers in wage subsidy, then we're committed to basic income in employment subsidy? I think not. And this is for two reasons. So the first, the expensive taste objection overlooks, I think, the fact that we may have special reasons to create new employment opportunities because of its intimate connection to self-respect. The thought here is that when we the characterization of wage subsidy and employment subsidy puts it purely in resources terms, in terms of individuals pursuing their particular projects. But we might think that misses something really important, which is that there's a prior concern for ensuring the social bases of self-respect, and that can countenance policies whose purpose is to eliminate involuntary unemployment. Now, I have some sympathy for this kind of view. I do, as you'll remember, think that employment is intimately connected to self-respect in this way. And so I do think that advocates of the asset argument can appeal to that thought in order to resist the generalization that Van Parijs wants. However, I don't think that this is fully satisfactory. And this is because I tend to believe even if employment weren't intimately connected to self-respect in the way that I believe it is, surely we would still have reasons to eliminate involuntary unemployment ahead of basic income, in the cases that I've described at least. But that is, even if we get rid of a concern for self-respect and we focus only on the fact that people who are employed enjoy better marriage prospects, they're able to pursue more congruent lifestyles, for example, even if those were the only considerations, I would still think that a policy of basic income rather than eliminating involuntary unemployment would be suboptimal in one way. So I think we need a second kind of response to the expensive taste objection. Now, here's my attempt at doing so. As wage subsidy is normally fleshed out, the initial scenario involves envy-freeness between the two sets of working class workers. The dissatisfied workers have a lower level of welfare than the satisfied workers, but they don't prefer the opportunities of the satisfied workers. After all, it's conceivable that they enjoy identical employment opportunities. It's just that some derive welfare from it and some don't.
Tom, just a quick note that you have just a few minutes left.
Yeah, great. I'm about 1 minute away, so good.
Oh, brilliant.
So what explains our reason for selecting the second option, I think, is a commitment to envy-freeness. What happens is we're opposing the relevance of welfare, and that explains why we should boost the wages of all workers in wage subsidy rather than only the dissatisfied ones. Now, If we extend this reasoning to the employment subsidy case, we can identify a justification for taxing workers to subsidize the employment opportunities of those who are involuntarily unemployed, but not those who are voluntarily unemployed. The reason for this is that those who are voluntarily unemployed don't envy the workers. They're voluntarily unemployed. They're happy with their employment opportunities. Now, if this is the case, then I think we can appeal to the importance of envy and the irrelevance of welfare in order to block Van Parijs's generalization from the wage subsidy case to the employment subsidy case. Okay, now, final point. In the wage subsidy versus employment subsidy case, I've written as if we must select between eliminating employment opportunities and basic income, as if those two are mutually exclusive. But of course they're not. What is mutually exclusive is a choice between eliminating unemployment, involuntary unemployment, and the highest sustainable basic income. And what I've provided you with is an argument against the highest sustainable basic income, and instead for diverting resources in order to eliminate involuntary unemployment. It is, of course, consistent with this result that we should have a basic income, just funded at a slightly lower level. In fact, Alex started the workshop by mentioning that perhaps perhaps most of the speakers are critical of basic income. That's not my case. In fact, I'm a supporter of basic income. It's just that I think it shouldn't be at the highest sustainable level. Okay, thanks very much for listening. I'm looking forward to hearing people's reactions and as well as to the rest of the workshop. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was really interesting and no doubt will be good fodder for discussion. So what we're going to do now is take a break for 10 minutes and then we'll have a response by Colin Mclean. So enjoy a little bit of break, everybody.
Great.
Hey, Ben, I was going to mention, I'll have a timer up, so you don't have to worry about, you know, cutting me off or anything.
Thanks, Colin.
I was going to apologize here that it's the notes I sent you yesterday might be a little out of date because just today, as I've been thinking about your paper, a few other thoughts popped into my head. So I'm
No worries.
okay. Yeah, won't be blindsiding or anything, but yeah, it'll be a little, yeah, a little different. So
yeah, don't worry, Colin. That's fine. Thanks, and thanks also for sending some thoughts in advance. That was really kind. Thank you.
oh yeah, no worries at all. The paper is really interesting, so pleasure's mine. Is Kat going to do some commentary?
Was that about my cat? My cat, Colin?
Oh, sorry, no, I was just saw Faye's cat, but yeah.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. I'm very happy and delighted to introduce Colin Mclean. He is a PhD student in the St. Andrews and Stirling PhD, well, I just said that twice. The St. Andrews and Stirling program in philosophy, and he has up to 15 minutes to respond to Tom's talk. So take it away, Colin.
Well, yeah, thanks, Tom, for the very engaging paper. I've been twisting myself in knots for the last week thinking about it. So, so I'd like to, basically what I'll do is I'm actually going to focus on the conditional model and its response to the decoupling objection, just because it's a little closer to my own area of research. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for regarding the second objection in the talk. So the first part I would like to, in your response, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on. One is the account of the value of employment, and in particular, so just some implications of the asset view. Because it seems to me if employment, we think of it as an asset, if we distinguish employment from, say, autonomous work, right, not forced work, I would say just any sort of autonomous work, then it seems sort of like autonomous work itself is a sort of asset. And employment's just one mode of work that also can be an asset. In that there's opportunity costs associated with volunteering, things like this. So if they're both if they can both be thought of as assets, and then there's in your paper you bring out a number of sources of or sort of benefits associated with employment. So obviously monetary stuff would matter, but like I said, self-respect, interpersonal benefits like friendship or life plans, and in that list, I was curious whether you found it plausible to put in not just sort of external bases of self-respect, but also say like internal bases of self-respect, like my expectations for myself and what I think I'm capable of, things like this. And in addition to that, something along the lines of like a societal value of some sort that can be cashed out in agent relative terms, like say the types of common goods or forms of life that ensure that I can pursue the things that I want to pursue, and there's reasonable employment is available. So I'm just thinking in terms of that source of value for employment, if there's a longer list there, and those two additional dimensions will just come in my sort of comments coming into this. So this internal sources of self-respect and societal value. So if we move to the conditional model, the implications for this is that, so you say that if the statistical norm of employment sort of is the case, then there are goods that are accessible to people who are employed that are less likely to be accessible to those that are unemployed. And you do have a quote at one point saying essentially, this might be a regrettable feature of our current system that there's this connection between these goods and employment. But we kind of have to live with it. And part of that seemed to be you seem to be skeptical of the efficacy of policy to change, like to sever this link between employment and these benefits. And also you seem to have sort of normative qualms about, like you said, about civil liberties, doing this would be sort of violating. And so what I wanted to press a little bit on there was if we're willing, not so much the efficacy aims, but say the normative claim, the normative worries. We're comfortable with, say, infringing on liberty and autonomy for the sake of some other goods, some other weighty goods, and we're also we're okay with doing that, and for the sake sometimes of liberty and autonomy themselves, right? And what I'm thinking is that if autonomous work is also an asset that can have value, and it could also have material value, self-respect, in terms of it can give self-respect. It can also have societal value. Then I would just be curious to hear more from you on why you think that this sort of infringement on liberty and autonomy for the sake of autonomous work, say, could not be justified, particularly if that autonomous work helps us more fully realize our own autonomy or gives us greater liberties or things like this. So that was just, so as a general sort of takeaway from that one part of my commentary is, I'm wondering if the conditional model, like it's not defective or anything, but the implications of it in terms of looking at diminishing involuntary unemployment, those come out of a really narrow focus maybe on the value of employment, on sort of first order agent relative benefits, and also not looking at, say, also the value of autonomous work and weighing it up against that. And also just this skepticism about this normative skepticism about policies that would try and sever that link. I'd just be curious to say why you don't think that could ever be justified. And the second part of this actually probably won't take up the whole 15 minutes here, but the second part of this, I think that ties into that comment is to do with your comments about the persistence of employment. And so even if we think that automation isn't going to affect the quantity of employment, say the ratio of labor demand to supply, there is good evidence that there's been a sort of change over the last 10, 15 years that it's affecting the distribution of quality of employment. And so in particular, I'm sure you said that, the labor polarization sort of phenomenon, right? You have high skill, high wage labor growth, but also a lot low skill, low wage labor growth, and a bit of a hollowing out in the middle. And I'm curious. I mean, I don't want to obviously get too rambly about conjectural models of where this trend could go. But on the assumption that the incentives for capital substitution for labor are, say, at a minimum the cost of labor and our technological capabilities, and on the assumption that there is sort of a finite task space in terms of like what are people capable of doing in terms of tasks, and if technology continues to encroach on that task space, one of the words I think that could be raised is that if low skill, low quality employment starts to predominate in terms of that's where the employment opportunities generally are, then what I'm wondering there is, would you think that in that, and it seems like your comments in the paper imply this, but a basic income in that case would be a lot more justified than just trying to get people employed in low quality jobs, or where they're yeah. And so that seems to me that, okay, what's riding on that claim is that their autonomous work that is their other option is more valuable to them than just this low quality employment, right? And it seems to me then, if that's the case, does that what does that say about the current situation where, say, there are opportunities for reasonable employment, but the reasonable employment is actually less valuable than autonomous work we could be doing? I hope if that's relatively, if I'm not kind of being convoluted. So what I mean, maybe just to keep this brief, I guess what this can be wrapped up as is saying, sort of, do you see a difference when we're talking about this from a policy perspective? Do you think it's important to make a difference, to mark the difference between the value of employment versus the value of autonomous work? And if there is a difference, is it a sufficient difference to justify policies that sever the link between the benefits of employment or employment and its benefits? And then the third part of that is, what if anything is the significance of automation's effects on the quality of employment for sort of our policy priorities here? Should we, if there is a justification for severing this link and automation is leading to, say, predominance of low quality employment, should we be prioritizing something like UBI and possibly policies that make that sort of like promote people valuing things, not just having a job that pays, but maybe like valuable volunteer work or artistic self-expression or whatever. So yeah, hopefully that wasn't too convoluted. It was, but yeah, thanks for the talk, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
Great, thanks so much, Colin. That was for those who didn't catch it earlier, Colin did me the kind favor of sending me notes a couple of days in advance. I had a little while to think about some of these questions, but they're really tricky. So I'll just kind of pick and choose. I'll try to be brief as well. So the first, so Colin notes that the list of the goods associated with employment that I give is incomplete, and notes that there might be questions about the kind of internal aspect of self-respect and social value, societal value as well. And here, I just wanted to know, I'm very open to these kinds of ideas. So So I'm kind of very skeptical of the idea that we could construct a list of all of the goods, all of the reasons that people sensibly value work for. We tend not to do that with other goods. I think we can just be kind of pluralist and say, look, people got different preferences. There's a common feature. Lots of people tend to value this thing for a diversity of reasons. Trying to kind of identify the meaning of employment, I kind of struggle with that. What's the meaning of any item or good? I kind of struggle with that. It's as if sometimes we write or think about these issues as if there's a kind of platonic form of employment that gives rise to a particular meaning. And I just think, hey, it's just another good that people value for different reasons. There's going to be a wide range of reasons. Philosophers tend to be pretty narrow-minded and focus on a few of them. But I think when you look at the social science, we quickly realize that employment serves a much broader range of, I think when you read kind of people working in urban studies who write about the decline of the labor force in those areas, they identify lots of considerations that philosophers kind of wouldn't address immediately. So I'm really open to, I think it's imperative that we do that. And I encourage philosophers thinking about these issues to look at the social science, because I think that's going to really help direct our attention. So I'm with you on that one. In terms of the efficacy or the limits of governments to change social norms, so there's a few things going on here. So I'm pretty confident in government's ability to change social norms. I'm less confident in their ability to do it reliably or within their control. I tend to think they try to change social norms and who knows where they end up. It's kind of difficult to exercise extreme control over norms, and that's where I'm kind of most worried. My point isn't, to be clear, my point isn't these social norms enjoy protection against attempts to change them from government. I think it's fine for governments to attempt to change social norms, including those around employment. But I just think there are going to be limits on how they can do that. So I don't think that governments are permitted to violate basic rights in order to change social norms. And since I think that social norms relating to employment are going to be pretty stubborn unless we, so long as we protect individuals' right to buy and sell labor, I think we're just kind of in a bit of a bind here. I think it's going to be very difficult to change those social norms without violating people's rights to buy and sell labor. And so that's the difficulty, I think. And then just here's what I think is the most important remark of Colin's. I have broader implication. I think Colin's totally correct to point out that technological change is really affecting the quality of work. It's leading to massive polarization. We've seen a doubling in the higher education wage premium. We're seeing a massive undersupply of good quality work for low skill employees. Mainly, I have in mind people who don't go to college, don't go to university. I think these are massively serious problems. And I think that it's imperative that government acts to change this. My point with only one thing they should do is to eradicate involuntary unemployment. I suspect that governments can do much more to improve the quality of work. So I tend to think massive investment in education would make a big difference here. I think, perhaps coupled with other kinds of measures. I think people are interested in minimum wage policy, for example. I know Ben is. Daron Acemoglu published a paper on minimum wage yesterday. Daron Acemoglu and I, we have slight differences on I think we basically share the view of the problems that are going on in kind of to do with automation, contemporary labor market, although we have slightly different solutions in mind, I think. But I fully agree with Colin that actually, when thinking about the future of work, huge attention has been given to the question of unemployment, specifically mass unemployment. And I do think those questions are important, but we mustn't neglect the fact that the quality of people's employment opportunities is of huge importance. And that massively vital issue has kind of skipped under the radar. And much more so for philosophers and people working in other fields. I think economists have actually done quite a lot of good work. Labor economists have done a lot of good work on employment quality. And so I think it's really important that we think about that issue in tandem with questions about unemployment. So I really thank Colin for bringing up that important issue. I hope that when we talk about the meaning of work, we'll also have some opportunity to talk about good jobs or desirable jobs or valuable jobs in comparison with bad ones as well. So thanks, Colin. I really appreciate that.
All right, thanks for a really stimulating discussion, Colin and Tom. We're in a 5-minute break now. Feel free to put up your hands right away, those of you who know you want to ask a question, but we're going to wait 5 minutes before we actually start calling on people.
Hey, Tom, quick question for you. I was just gonna say, because I won't raise my hand here, obviously, because I just rambled for 12 minutes. But do you have time just briefly, maybe next week, just to chat really quickly? Because there's a few things I think I just totally brushed through because I totally rewrote everything this morning.
That would be great.
Yeah, but it kind of I was interested in what you had to say because it does sort of relate to kind of the stuff I'm working on in freedom and things like that. And I'd be curious to hear.
Oh, that would be fun. Yeah, no, Colin, I'd really like that. Yeah.
That'd be great.
I had a bit more to say in response to your final remarks about the quality of work and how automation or technology might be changing that and what its implications are for labour market policy making.
Yeah,
it'd be good to chat through and hear more of your thoughts on these issues. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I definitely like to hear more on the your reticence about from the civil liberties side of things, but yeah, but yeah, let me know, or I can,
Right.
yeah, just let me know when you have a time. I'm open.
Yeah.
So, cool.
Yeah, I'm going to make a note now.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Hello, I just want to say hi and thanks for organizing this, because I'll have to go out and back in again. I don't know if I'll have a chance. I will miss some of Tom's session and maybe also some of the next session, but I hope to be able to be back.
No problem at all. Well, since you do have to go out and come back, why don't you go first? So Anke Gauss, first question, fire away.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Did we resume the session?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry,
we're resuming the question. The
took
session.
me a second to take down the poster.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom, for the presentation. And I'm not going to try to change your mind about this, because I've done that already unsuccessfully. But I want to say a few things and actually ask you to say more about how different parts of what you said connect to each other. So that on the one hand, your skepticism about an ability to persuade people not to value employment so much, your reluctance to go into the question of the value of work, and the point that you have just made at the end in the reply to Colin's comments about how important it is to start thinking about good jobs, not just jobs. So it seems to me that first there is a bit of tension between the second and the third. So on the one hand, you're not very willing to think too much about what makes work valued by people. But on the other hand, you'd like to think about what can make a job a good job. And I'm not quite sure how you can go about the second question without going through the first one, at least to some extent. Yeah. And then the other question is that, well, you gave us a list of things that states can do in order to address the problem you discussed, both at the supply and the demand side. And one may think that one thing you can do at the supply side is to actually get the message across to people who have been probably raised to believe that their state is dependent on having a job.
Anke, you're cutting out a bit.
I'm sorry, I also hear some noise, but is it better now? Sorry about that. So one thing you can do, of course, is to try to not just tell people that it's okay for your standing in society not to be employed, but also to give them ideas, and perhaps more than ideas, opportunities of how to go about securing the goods of work outside employment. But then, of course, in order to do this, you really need to know what are the main reasons why people value work. Maybe it's because that's where they find future spouses, or maybe that's because they don't know how to structure their time. They've never learned how to structure their time consistently without the external pressure of a job. Or it may be because that's where they exercise excellence and other virtues. In any case, it seems that many of the things that you are proposing in the paper and outside it do seem to require you to ease up a bit on this reluctance to go into thinking about the value of work, including the value that work has for people.
Great, thanks, Anke. That's really. I hope that I can persuade you there's less distance between us than we might think. So there are. So here's how I tend to think about it. There are two versions of the asset argument and the conditional model, corresponding to two distinct accounts of value. So you could have a reason-based account of value, or you can have a preference-based account of value. And the reason-based account of value is going to identify particular reasons, objective reasons to value work. And I take it that kind of account is going to be appealing to perfectionists. So to perfectionists who think we just need to identify particular properties of employment or particular properties of good employment, and those are ones that we need to promote. So that's the kind of the reason-based approach. But you can also have a preference-based approach to value, where we just say, it's because people value these goods for a range of reasons that the state has reason to act. And that's going to be, I think, more amenable to an anti-perfectionist who says, I don't take a stand on whether employment in fact has any value or not. I just want to say people in fact desire it, and people in fact, people who are involuntarily unemployed envy other people's opportunities. And the anti-perfectionist view that I have in mind says we should just consult people's preferences and we should treat them as providing us with reasons for action, rather than having to invoke a reason-based conception of value, of the value of employment. So now, in the presentation, I hoped not really to pick between the reason-based and the preference-based conception of value, because I would like for my view to be available to perfectionists as well as anti-perfectionists like myself. When it comes to the question of good jobs, I think that the perfectionist account has really emerged as the dominant one. And it says something like, we identify this range of properties of good jobs and then seek to promote them. But there's an anti-perfectionist strategy as well, which just says what we should attempt to do is just empower people to negotiate their own terms of employment that serve their own interests, at least within limits. So I think that the anti-perfectionist says we need a kind of more procedural approach, and the goal of policymakers in promoting high quality work should just be to improve the bargaining power of workers. That might mean both between workers, so improve the bargaining power of working class workers in comparison with middle class ones, but also to improve the bargaining power of workers in comparison with firms. So we might worry about the declining share of labour, for example, and we might think that we should try to just boost worker bargaining power and then just empower workers themselves to negotiate terms of employment that they see as serving their interests. Now, that second approach doesn't refer to any particular properties of good jobs. It says bargaining power is what's important. And I defend that second kind of view, the kind of bargaining power view, rather than the more prescriptive view that says we must identify particular reasons to value good jobs, for example. So I think that there might end up being differences between us, but I don't think that they're going to be quite as stark as some people worry. I think that actually that the anti-perfectionist who wants to withhold certain judgments about the value of work can get on board with lots of the stuff that perfectionists are advocating.
I see, but
okay. Sorry, I'm gonna jump in and not allow you a follow-up. Very sorry, Anka. Please do feel free to raise your hand so that you can ask that follow-up later if we have a moment. I'm just going to call on the next person on the list. And one thing I should have said is just when you do get called on, make sure to ask just one question. Okay. Sorry about possibly pronunciation problems. Diana Elena Popescu. Go ahead.
Thank you. And yes, great pronunciation of my name, and it's great to see everyone. And thanks so much for the paper, Tom. I really, really enjoyed it. And one of the things I liked most about it is the way you combine ideal theory and non-ideal theory considerations, because I think that's what makes the idea of ending involuntary unemployment very plausible. And then it was very good of you to bring both sets of considerations in this paper. However, my question is going to be on one case that makes the two. Pulls the two apart. And that's the case of training, which you did mention as something that you want to encourage, especially when it takes the form of training for employment. It also seems to be a way of resolving the problem of disgruntled or discouraged workers if you keep workers in training. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think about the idea of having training opportunities included alongside work? So maybe would you be in favor of ending involuntarily not being in training, as it were? And the reason I'm asking this is that the goods that you have identified as being correlated to employment can also be said to correlate very easily with being in training. It increases your self-respect. You can get validation from peers who are in the same training programs as you, marriage prospects and family prospects, perhaps even better. I mean, I guess all of us have been targeted at some point with ads about joining, I don't know what, for a photography class to meet a new mate. So it might actually be better than just employment and so on and so forth. But the problem and the reason why I think this pulls apart the ideal theory and non-ideal theory considerations is that, of course, if you want to say everyone can stay in training for as long as possible, then some of the economic appeal of ending involuntary unemployment go away. So where would you stand on this issue, given your arguments?
A great question. Nice to see you, and thanks for the great question. Two things to say. So first is what I've been advocating for is simply providing individuals with a certain set of opportunities, and I've said nothing about their duties, for example. So I've said nothing about whether individuals have a duty to work or a duty to train, or whether it would be permissible for individuals to spend their days in unemployment or on the beach or whatever. So I want to focus only on what rights individuals have, and the duties question is a kind of separate one. And then I think you're completely correct to maintain that training is going to be a really important part of that, and subsidized training, government subsidized training, is going to be a really crucial part of that. This is part of a broader, Ben noted, part of a broader project, writing a book on the future of work. And one of the chapters on the book is on training, and specifically on the job training. Here's just a final word. It gets kind of complicated because intuitively, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that governments need to do much more to retrain or to train individuals to get people into work. The difficulty is that the empirical evidence isn't all that encouraging. There's variation. In Germany, they have a much better system than lots of other parts of the world, for example, but retraining programs tend not to have a massively great track record. So there's a reason that people who might have read Anne Case and Angus Deaton's recent book on Deaths of Despair, they talk about various things that governments can do to get people back into work. And notably, retraining doesn't really appear on the menu. And the reason for that is simply that the authors don't think that retraining tends to be all that effective. The empirical evidence suggests that often it's very expensive and isn't always that successful. So this is another area where I think if we're going to advocate for retraining, the importance of retraining, we need to do so in a way that's appropriately sensitive to the empirical data. And that's what makes me nervous in this case. Maybe there's much more that we can do to learn from countries like Germany and to export that kind of model. But I think it's significant that when countries have tried this, it's not always been as rosy as we'd hope. So I share your sentiment, but there are at least some concerns that I think we'll need to engage with.
Okay, moving on now, Angie O'Sullivan.
Hi, Tom. Thank you for the great talk. I really enjoyed that. I guess maybe it's more of a clarificatory question about sort of the extent to which you think UBI could also deliver some of the goods that you mentioned. So yeah, if I've understood your argument correctly, you're saying that we should prefer policies aimed at employment rather than UBI because the involuntarily unemployed envy certain goods such as congruence and family stability. But I guess I was thinking that somebody who favors UBI might think that UBI is exactly the sort of thing that, along with self-respect, is going to level the playing field here. So maybe a reason why unemployment involuntarily so might result in family instability is, arguments about how to pay the bills and all of these things. And also, if all your friends are at work, then you have the congruence problem. But you might think that on UBI, then you wouldn't have the financial worries that lead to family instability in the first place. And you also might think that you have all of your friends, maybe half of them are, employed part-time now or also on UBI. And so you'd be able to get your congruence that way.
Great. So thanks for the great question. So I am a defender of UBI. So I'm supportive of the idea. But here's the kind of narrow claim that I wanted to make. I'll say something a bit more about it in a moment. But the narrow claim was just, if we have a choice between basic income, where some people will be involuntarily unemployed, or a slightly lower level of basic income, where everyone has employment opportunities, then I think we can't appeal to the expensive tastes objection to justify the first over the second. And that's what Van Parijs wants to do. You know, he has a manner of arguments, but that's at least one of them. And I just wanted to note caution there. It may be conveniently that a generous basic income in fact delivers employment opportunities for everyone. It might be that it has some kind of multiplier effect, or it might be that in fact basic income enables people to find work that's really more suited to their interest, and that ends up being more profitable. And then there's a kind of convenient marriage of the views such that we don't have to pick between them. I would like that. My only worry is when that's not the case, I think we need to commit to one of the two. I agree with you that that basic income is going to deliver a lot of the goods that we like, and I think so. There was an interesting paper published last year in the QJ Quarterly Journal of Economics that talks about basically how long unemployment benefits have a kind of unemployment trap effect, where they disincentivize people from finding work. And you might think one of the real attractions or appeals of basic income is that it would eradicate the unemployment trap. And so people would be kind of one impediment to finding work, the conditionality of benefits, would be removed. Now, if empirical stories like that are true, then the case for basic income becomes even stronger in my eyes. So I'm really sympathetic to basic income. It's just like I wanted to resist the extreme claim that the expensive taste objection justifies the highest sustainable basic income at the expense of targeted policies to eliminate involuntary unemployment. So the bit of a niche kind of objection that I wanted to respond to, but given that it's Van Parijs who's written extensively about these issues, and as far as I know, no one has really picked up this trend in Van Parijs' view, I think it's worth taking that kind of seriously as well. But thanks, Angie. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, let's hear from, again, if I butcher the name, sorry, Darmid Weir.
Yeah, sorry, just getting my microphone up. My internet connection went down at the beginning of Tom's talk, so I apologize if this was something that he maybe referred to, but as far as I'm aware, he didn't mention the possibility that, as we talked about voluntary and involuntary unemployment, but of course one might also talk about voluntary and involuntary employment, in the sense that clearly there is a right to buy and sell your own or exchange your own labor, but the question is, if employment is the only means to access, subsistence, is that itself a violation of a right that we should take seriously? And therefore, is that a justification for saying, if there's a UBI, then that particular violation of rights is thereby removed?
Great. So again, two things. So one is, for the purpose of the presentation and this paper, I wanted not to take a stand on that question. But so all I mean by that is I'm open to the idea that there's something problematic about a labour market in which individuals must sell their labour in order to put food on the table. I'm open to that kind of complaint against contemporary labour markets. My thought was this: there's this further complaint when individuals lack employment opportunities. Now, as it happens, so I didn't want to rule it out. As it happens, I think there are versions of the complaint that you identified, which I'm sympathetic to, but we've got to be very careful here. So really what troubles me most is when there are some individuals who are lucky enough that they don't need to sell their labor. So, I think a study came out last year suggesting that 1 in 8 people in the UK will inherit the average lifetime earnings. 1 in 8 will inherit the average lifetime earnings, and these people plainly don't need to sell their labour. It's a significant proportion of the UK population. And what really concerns me is that those 12% of people don't have to sell their labour, but the rest do. That kind of inequality is especially troubling to me. But you're right, there might be this further complaint, nothing to do with the inequality, just about anyone having to sell their labour. I think these are vitally important questions, it's just ones that I don't pick up today. But I hope that we get a chance to discuss them in more depth in the next day or so.
Thank you.
Okay, next up, Chris Zhang.
All right, thank you. Hi there. Hi, Tom. Nice to see you
Chris.
again for I don't know how many times this week. Right. So I think my question is I would say so would be a follow up to that of Anka's in a sense. So I guess I wanted you to say a little bit more on taste per se. I notice I mentioned taste rather than expensive taste. So I wonder if in your thinking that there exists a distinction between different tastes, so to speak, and in terms of us weighing them up, right? So it seems to me that there is one may want to work in a suitable job, but whereas this particular suitable job might not be the most desirable job for this person. And obviously the similar thought goes that there might be a best available job out there that is perhaps currently out of reach, or perhaps this individual might want to try harder, right? So we see a sort of taste problem on this side. So do you have a sort of complaint on this individual if he so chooses a particular kind of job? So I guess this is like one sort of taste spectrum, if I may say so. And it seems to me that there's another sort of form of taste that is that could be playing here when it comes to the sort of macro side of the things, right? So I'm here imagining a case whereby, I mean, as you say, individuals who might be willing or unwilling to go into employment or unemployment, right? So in this case, if I throw these people into the mix, right? So we have the taste for different jobs, or different sort of suitability or desirability of jobs, and then we have the taste for whether to go into employment at all, right? So I wonder in this case whether you think that there is a sort of difference between two sort of different kinds of taste, and if so, how might you go about in resolving the difference without invoking what Anka was saying, I suppose, earlier about the meaning of work, so to speak. Thank you.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Grace. Yeah, you're totally correct that there's going to be different kinds of tastes going on here. So here's one area that will pollute my analysis. So when talking about the employment subsidy case, I discussed people who are involuntarily unemployed and those who are voluntarily unemployed. Now take the voluntarily unemployed. Now within that, there's in fact a distinction between what we might call the willingly voluntarily unemployed and the reluctantly voluntarily unemployed. The distinction is as follows. Might be that there are some people who think, I just really love spending my time on the beach. This is the best life for me. I'm willingly, voluntarily unemployed. There are others for whom they say, if the employment opportunities available to me were really fantastic ones, then I would love to be employed. But it's just not the case. So these people are reluctantly, voluntarily unemployed. If their employment opportunities were much better, then they would go into employment. So I think there's an important distinction there, and the distinction is gonna vary depending on the quality of work available to individuals. So I was just simplifying by talking about the involuntarily unemployed of both kinds. But you're right, once we add in these kind of complications, we're gonna need to recalculate. Because as I noted, I think what individuals have a right to on the asset argument is just reasonable employment opportunities. And that I think is going to be needed to be measured kind of objectively. So I don't think what counts as reasonable is going to be specific to individuals. And that's for the following reason. And this is the point in the presentation. I did quite well so far. This is the point in the presentation at which I alienate everyone who's watching in now by saying something that will irritate everyone. And this is the problem, if we make it too subjective, is that it gives too much weight to individual subjective valuations. So the worry is, when you say you have a right to a reasonable job, if you make that sensitive to people's own preferences, that effectively amounts to a subsidy for the educated middle classes. So I teach at a university with a very high proportion of privately educated students with very good job prospects. And when they finish their degree, some of them become unemployed, and then they complain that there aren't reasonable employment opportunities available to them. Say, oh, I wasn't able to get into the grad scheme that I wanted. And my response is, you've got plenty of employment opportunities to you. It's just they're not quite as good as you wish they were. And so I want to be able to say to these people, tough luck. You've got your higher education. You've got actually very good employment opportunities. You know, the undergraduate, you know, the overwhelming majority have very good employment opportunities. The people whose employment opportunities I'm most concerned about are the people who didn't get into college or didn't go to university in the first place. And academics tend to focus a lot on the fate of those with a college education and neglect the 50% of the population who don't. And so that's why I think we need an objective account, because I want to say, when my students say, oh, I want a suitable job working in a law firm, and I've got a complaint, I think you're like the footballers who complain when they don't, the 14-year-old footballer who says, I should have been signed by Man United, and I've got a complaint at the fact that my career has been hobbled by not being, I think, unlucky. That's not the kind of view I'm sympathetic to. So that's why we need a kind of objective measure, I think. Yeah.
Okay, moving on, I'm going to call on Irena Rosenthal.
Hi, thank you. One question before I have a question for Tom. Is it right that everyone has their camera off, or is it just my connection?
It's your connection.
Okay, right. So I'll just put my camera on because I don't see anyone else. But well, thanks for the very stimulating presentation, Tom. I had a question. I was trying to think through your argument through a gender lens. What if you take into account that in a lot of societies, people have very different preferences about employment based on gender? And because if I understand you correctly, you do not argue for sort of an objective account for the value of work. It's not an account of the value, or why work should matter in an ideal society, but it's conditional upon statistical norms, sort of the value that people now in empirical societies attach to work. But then how would you defend your argument in a society where that statistical norm is very gendered, and where maybe it's not actually the majority that values employment, but rather a male majority, and where, let's say, women for different sorts of reason would rather prefer not to work and engage in care, for example? To what extent does that complicate your argument?
Great. Nice to meet you, Irena. After we've emailed, but we've never met before. Yeah. But so thanks for joining. Thanks for the question. So here I think is an important issue. So individuals' attitudes towards work are often shaped by social norms, and some of those social norms might be unjust in character. And when that's the case, that gives us reason to cast doubt on the result. So on the resulting inequalities, for example. Now, in the case of men's and women's attitude toward work, I do think that this is going to be important. So I do think that when we talk about fetishizing employment, I think that that kind of attitude is especially intense among men. And actually, I think it's especially intense among middle-class men. I think this has a class dimension as well as a gender dimension. Now, there are complications here, however, because one important question, I think, is in the absence of unjust social norms, what would people's attitudes towards employment be like? And I think that counterfactual question is really important. So there are some people who think that it's true that social norms are partly responsible for men valuing employment or tending to value employment and women tending to value care work, but they think that those preferences might be overdetermined it might be, partly a product of other considerations as well. So, for example, physical facts about pregnancy are likely, on this view, to change people's attitudes towards care work and employment. And if that were the case, then we wouldn't be able to say it's only social norms that are leading to this result. We'd have to open the door to the possibility that there are other explanations as well. Now, the significance of that will need to be worked out in detail. I think it's actually kind of tricky and interesting about what we want to say about these cases. As I think I'm interested in questions of gender inequality in labour markets, and so I don't want to say too much now because I think it's complex basically. But I do agree with you that when we shouldn't take for granted the idea of the premises of the asset argument, namely that people value employment, especially when that's true only for a subset of the population. So I agree with you that perhaps we should cast doubt on that, and that might give us slightly weaker conclusions than I've suggested.
Okay, moving on now, Christopher Trooper. Are you there? You may be on mute because it looks to me like you're trying to talk, but we're not hearing you. You are definitely on mute, actually. I've just checked. Okay, let's go to Darren Thomas instead.
Will this work now? Right.
Oh, okay, sorry, Darren. You're coming through, but very muffled.
Okay.
Oh,
that's better.
Yeah,
that's
I think we'll be able to hear you now.
Okay. What I wanted to ask was, since not all work is paid employment, and UBE might help us to refocus those kinds of work that are not paid work. May this tip the balance in your argument? So UBE might somehow stress the value of spiritual work, of artistic work, of care work, and so might this make a difference to the balance in your argument?
Yeah, great. So yes, I'm completely open to the relevance of these considerations. So in fact, I don't think that this is the strongest way on which to defend basic income, but I do think part of a strong defense is going to be that it gives individuals opportunities to pursue a much wider range of activities, including creative self-expression, for example. So certainly I didn't want to rule that out. I guess just to reiterate, my target was just much more limited. My target was just, or my aim, I suppose, was just to defend the kind of narrow conclusion that governments have a duty to eliminate, that's slightly to at least address involuntary unemployment. I'm fully open to the idea that there are many other things they should do besides that in order to foster volunteer work or artistic self-expression outside of the labour market, and I'm completely supportive of those kind of endeavours. I take it that is a good argument in defence of basic income. So I'm a kind of pluralist when it comes to these kind of matters. I think there's going to be just a range of considerations that's going to bear on government policy here.
Okay, next up is Darren Thomas.
Thank you, Tom. That was a great talk, and I actually see a lot of parallels between your talk and the talk I'm about to give. So I'll be really interested to hear some of your thoughts on it. Actually, my question was very similar to the last one, and I was just going to sort of put on a follow-up. But yeah, I think sort of separate from it as a justification for UBI, I'm curious if you think that your argument has any implications about what the obligations are on a government level to provide non-employment forms of work, or to yeah, I mean, UBI might be one way to ensure that people have access to them, but maybe you think that those obligations could also look different. I don't know.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks, Darren. So thanks for following up. That's helpful. So here's a point that I ought to have emphasized. So the kind of decoupling objection says there's just a range of goods, a very wide range of goods that individuals value employment for, and part of the responsibility of government is to decouple that and ensure that those goods are available outside of employment. Now, that might mean making sure that individuals have opportunities to work, though not for paid employment, but volunteer work, for example. But it might also be possible to ensure that goods are available in other means, not through work at all. So if like me, you think that one reason that people value employment is because of the social contact, the sense of community with others, and you worry about people who are unemployed being isolated, then you might think one responsibility of government is to combat that isolation by publicly funding public spaces, parks, or other museums, or other kinds of institutions where individuals might meet each other. That wouldn't be kind of subsidizing work, but that would be ensuring that there's a kind of infrastructure in place to ensure that individuals who are unemployed don't suffer the same kind of debilitating disadvantage that they do in our society, where in recent years there's been a kind of aggressive attack on public infrastructure and public spaces. And so I think that exactly for the reasons that you identified, governments can have these kinds of responsibilities to ensure that individuals who are unemployed aren't disadvantaged to nearly the level that they currently are. So that's going to apply not only to kind of infrastructure and public spaces, there might be things to do with social norms or other economic policies. So again, I'm pretty open-minded. I encourage policymakers to be creative here, attentive to the full range of considerations in mitigating the disadvantage endured by involuntarily unemployed people.
Thank you.
Okay, next up, Alex Douglas.
Yes, I'll add my thanks to everybody else for such a great presentation and for helping us to recover from the first session so nicely. I just wanted to ask, I missed a stage in Van Parijs's argument that I remember from the book in your presentation, which is, I remember him saying that in order for jobs to count as scarce, for jobs to count as assets, they have to be scarce. And so he considers a case where he says, somebody could object, a person who's in employment, so, you're taxing me to pay somebody who isn't working at all, so you're discriminating in favor of the person who prefers leisure. And Van Parijs says that argument would be valid were it not for the case that jobs are scarce, that the person doesn't have an equal opportunity to get their own job and earn the same income because of this microeconomic theory, which is the efficiency wage theory. That means that, right, so there's not a market clearing wage that allows everybody to have a job at the going wage. So it struck me that, when you're talking about policies of the sort that you're discussing on the demand side, wouldn't those policies remove the scarcity of jobs? I mean, if the government was just creating, employment for everybody, and therefore just kind of undermine, cut the whole ground from under Van Parijs's argument.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Alex. So a few things to say. So the first is, you're right that that one argument that Van Parijs gives is a kind of rent sharing argument. So given a kind of efficiency theory of wages, he thinks that people who have jobs are going to end up deriving more from those jobs than they would under fair competition. And then part of the role of government is to redistribute that rent back to people who are involuntarily unemployed. So that's one kind of argument. One response, which you noted, is to say, if everyone has jobs, then what's the rent inequality? And then I think Van Parijs notes that there can still be rent, because it can still be that individuals with high earning jobs earn more rent than individuals with low earning jobs. So even if you had a society of full employment and you just have CEOs who are getting massive wages because of the wage theory of inefficient theory of wages, and then burger flippers who are getting very little, then you still have a rent sharing argument for redistribution from CEOs to burger flippers. The second thing to note is Vampirize gives one kind of argument, but my argument is, so I just have a kind of more straightforwardly egalitarian argument, a kind of envy-freeness argument, where I think what really troubles me is just the fact that some people have access to this asset that other people lack access to. And I think that in itself is going to give rise to a kind of complaint, at least if you're a kind of egalitarian. I'm worried about a world in which, you know, all of the employment opportunities are enjoyed by men and none enjoyed by women, or all of them are enjoyed by middle class, educated students and none are enjoyed by working class, uneducated students. And I think that's kind of sufficient to justify the beginnings of the asset argument. But you're right, I went over Vampirize's rent sharing argument. I kind of ignored that aspect of the view. But thanks, Alex.
Rebecca, is your question the kind of question that can be asked extremely quickly?
Yeah, I can try.
All right.
Okay, I guess, thanks so much, Tom, for your talk. I guess, so I was just wondering who exactly you're trying to address with the asset argument and what its policy relevance was, because it seems to me that governments do in general try to minimize involuntary unemployment, but obviously they have to balance that against inflation considerations, minimum wages, etc. So yeah, I guess I was wondering what you thought the policy significance of the asset argument was,
great.
If at all.
So yeah, no, great. Nice to see you again, Becca. So I don't take it to be the asset argument in itself. I don't take it to be especially controversial. In fact, I assume that something like that argument is assumed by lots of policymakers. In fact, I think, you know, policymakers I know have that kind of view in mind. I just wanted to offer a kind of clear version or a clear statement of the view, partly so that then what I regard as more controversial stuff is the conditional model and the response to Vampirize on the extensive taste. So I don't take the asset argument to be especially controversial. I hope it just kind of crystallizes the view in a clear form and notes that, you know, we don't have to take a stand on some questions like the reason, the objective reasons to value work or anything like that. That anti-perfectionists or preference theorists can get on board with this kind of view as well.
Okay, well, you delivered as promised, Rebecca. Nice short answer there, Tom. So again, Tom and Colin Mclean, can't thank you guys enough for doing such a wonderful job and initiating such a great discussion. And to all of you who asked questions, that was really stimulating. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. That was, you know, having anyone attend a talk is a pleasure. And with so much Zoom fatigue going on, the fact that people are willing to sit and listen and engage with these issues so constructively is a real reward, and I really appreciate that. So thanks everyone.
So we're on a break now until a half hour from now, 3 o'clock British time. We'll return with Darren Thomas and basic income and the goods of work. Hope to see you all there. This window will close and I'll immediately open the window that we'll all use for Darren's talk. Bye, everybody.